Good evening, everybody, and welcome to SACAP's workshop series, The Practice Dialogue with Rahim Thawer. I'm your host, Stephanie Ramphel, and I'm the social media and events coordinator for SACAP. So just a few house rules before we proceed. We will have a short Q&A at the end of this presentation, so please do send us your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We are also aware that there's high internet usage in the country, thus slowing down connection in some areas. We also know that load shedding could take place at any moment, so should you or any of our panelists be cut off due to this, kindly note that the recording will be made available to you. Please also be advised that we are still working from home, so should you hear an occasional microwave beep, a dog in the background, we do apologize in advance. So why did you become or want to become a human service practitioner? Rahim says that whether in social work or psychology, the most common response he gets is, I wanted to support with and work with people who struggle in a similar way that I did. There's nothing wrong with this motivation. However, he says it can be tricky to work in a community that you belong to. So tonight, Rahim will take us through cultural safety and countertransference, as well as how it translates when working in communities that you belong to. Thereafter, Dr. Masinga will share a bit more about SACAP's focus on community mental health promotion. So without further ado, I will now hand over to SACAP's Head of Social Work and Community Development Faculty, Dr. Masinga.
Thank you, Steph. Good evening, everybody. It is an honor and a great pleasure for me to be introducing Rahim tonight. Rahim is our international visiting scholar from Toronto, Canada. He is one of the most talented, multi-qualified, and multi-skilled. Rahim is a registered psychotherapist. He's also a clinical supervisor and a sessional lecturer at University of Toronto and Waterloo. He's also, in his private capacity, a consultant and a writer. Currently, he's busy writing a book that is due to be published in 2023, titled Innovation in Queer Relations. Rahim's area of interest include intersections of systemic oppression and mental health. He's also interested in queer relationships, hence he's writing a book that I'm looking forward to in 2023. As our first international visiting scholar, Rahim has been and will continue to be our guest lecturer going forward. He's also going to be presenting a series of workshops targeting both academics, students, and practitioners. Please join me tonight to welcome Rahim at SACAP and into tonight's presentation. I encourage all of you to engage him and tap into his amazing experiences. Rahim, it is a great pleasure for us to have you as a part of SACAP. I invite you today to amaze us again, like you've done in the past two workshops. The accolades and the messages from our students and our practitioners and our educators, sharing their experiences of being part of your presentation, encourages me to continue to want to work with you. I present you to tonight's presentation. Over to you, Rahim. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Poppy. That was a beautiful introduction, a lot to live up to, but also very exciting. It's been really lovely to be here in South Africa and to think about how practice of social work, counseling, and psychology is both similar and different in our cultural context. One of my interests in mental health work is focusing on the individual through psychotherapy treatment, but also thinking about systemic issues, issues of oppression and privilege, and how they impact the psychotherapy practice and how they impact the treatment. So there's some key concepts that we're going to talk about today. And those concepts include cultural safety, transference, and countertransference. So transference and countertransference are are things that we hear all the time. And I just want to say that even if you're not doing one-on-one work, or you don't feel like your work is psychotherapy specifically, these concepts are still relevant. So for all social workers, psychologists, registered counselors here in South Africa, when you do case management work, you do case consultations, you coordinate programs and services for clients, these issues arise in the dynamic. And even though these concepts arise from psychodynamic psychotherapy, it's not my intent to convert you into psychoanalysts tonight. Rather, it is to think about how we can borrow from a rich modality, one where a lot of foundational concepts of therapy have originated, and to think about how it's relevant and how it makes sense in our current context. I will go through 5 cases, and I will open the floor for discussion through the chat box. And I'd love to hear what people think. And the questions I'm going to be asking you are, how do we support the practitioner process their reactions to their clients? So that's the key question we're asking tonight. How do we support practitioners to process their reactions to clients in various situations? All right, so let's get on with defining cultural safety. This is a concept that drew many people into this webinar today. And people asked, what is cultural safety? And without even hearing a specific definition, people have an idea of what it means. So cultural safety is a concept that I first heard expressed and articulated through Indigenous healthcare workers back in Canada. And through my reading and literature review, I see it show up in literature that's coming out of New Zealand, speaking with Maori, which is Indigenous nurses. And while it's being talked about in a healthcare setting in general, cultural safety has begun, from my understanding, in a pedagogical setting, so in an educational sense. The notion of cultural safety amounts to several key strategies: recognizing the histories and current contexts that structure inequality, embodying and enacting difference, mutual respect, and serious but playful engagement, and especially an explicit emphasis on tolerance of not knowing as a bracketing of professional expertise, a realistic appraisal of limitations, and an ethical stance before the face of the other. Now, this is written in a perspective that speaks to practitioners, whether they're educators or they're clinicians or they're both. And it encourages us to really think about our own comfort with not knowing and lateralizing power and being comfortable learning about the client's circumstances from their perspective. It also encourages us to think about structural inequality and the context in which our clients live. So this sounds very much like it's about educating the practitioner to better support the client. And while that's very true, in mental health settings, I would argue that the concept of cultural safety has been taken up in a number of ways. It's become quite normalized for clients to seek a practitioner who presumably has some shared life experience. Psychoanalyst and Professor Malin Forrest talks about this as a similarity of non-privilege. Sometimes it can look like a similarity of privilege as well, but primarily we see people who say things like, I really want a racialized therapist, or I really want to work with a case manager who understands my life experience. So someone who has lived experience with addiction, for example, or who is a trans person who's navigated a complex healthcare system. So in mental health care settings, we're seeing clients and consumers think about cultural safety in their own way. And there is a strong interest in working in communities or receiving service from people who have certain kinds of lived experience or shared identities. In these contexts, when people are paired with appropriate practitioners, the practitioners are often drawing both from personal experience and they're integrating social and political insights. both historical and present, right? So the practitioner is doing a lot of work. They're drawing on their own subjectivity. They're thinking about, how do I know about the world based on my lived experience? And it's being valued in a particular way. And I might be anxious about bringing it forward, but also I'm going to pad it with, it's going to be informed by how I understand the world and also the community in which both me and the client belong. Now, what's good about this? What's really positive is that when we have a sense of sameness or a sense of emotional and cultural safety with our clients, or they experience that with us, it allows clients not to be in a position to have to educate us about their marginalized community. They don't feel like they're representatives of an entire population. And there's an ease in exploring nuances within a particular community. So, for example, I am a gay man. If I went to a straight therapist, which I've done and had positive experiences, but what made it successful was that I didn't have to explain the nuances, the internal hierarchies, and the ways some people in the community are more accepted than others. Or I didn't have to go into depth in explaining how masculinity affects gay men. So without having to do that extra work, that cultural safety or emotional safety was established. Now, in any relationship, in any professional relationship, there's going to be this experience of transference. To quote Dr. Jonathan Shetler, who I think is probably one of the most widely known marketing people for psychodynamic therapy. He speaks eloquently about some of the key concepts. He describes transference as the activation of pre-existing expectations, templates, scripts, fears, and desires in the context of the therapy relationship, with the client viewing the therapist through the lenses of early important relationships. So that means somebody new comes into the room, and without me saying very much, they begin to form an understanding of who I am, a series of expectations, assumptions, and none of them are bad. They're all interesting, but they're formed by that client's early relationships or relationships in general. The client's perceptions of us as practitioners are not incidental to treatment. I would say what that means is they're not on the periphery. They're not just something to be ignored. Even if you don't address them in your work directly, in supervision or in a consultation setting, it makes sense to talk about how you think the client sees you. It's also important not to think about the client's perceptions of us as interferences or distractions from the work. So if somebody really, really likes you, if somebody really, really has a strong negative reaction towards you, if both the client and the therapist can tolerate it, there's something to work with there. There's something to learn from. So this concept of transference is actually at the heart of the therapeutic process. It is specifically because old patterns, scripts, and expectations, desires, and these schemas become active and alive, that we're able to help clients understand and rework them. Now, I've heard some people say, what if this is BS? What if there's no transference happening? And I would say, when you frame it that way, you make it sound like it's a bad thing or like a bad thing has occurred. People often make that assumption with the concept of countertransference. Students or new clinicians I supervise will sometimes say things like, oh, there's no countertransference reaction. And I would say, I think you mean there's no negative reaction. There's always a countertransference reaction. So first we have to recognize that this is just something that happens in the dynamic and is neither positive nor negative, but merely something for us to examine. Now, how do we explore transference, right? What does it mean to examine it, to think about it? So first of all, some questions we have to ask if we want to identify it and be able to name it. we might have to ask, how does the client see you as a person in the world, as a practitioner? So for example, I've had clients look me up and they really like my bio and they're really, really excited about some of the work I've done in the community. And they'll tell me that in the first session. So I have this inkling that there's a kind of idealized transference. How does that impact the relationship? Well, this person might really want to impress me. So it might take me a little bit longer to see them being more vulnerable, or for me being able to examine the parts of them that they don't want me to see. Do they understand me as impermanent, competitive, or disingenuous? You know, when you work in a nonprofit agency, or when you work with somebody who has run through many service providers and many therapists, it becomes challenging because they know that they want to be in this kind of therapeutic relationship. They would say wholeheartedly that they're here for some kind of help and some kind of support. But if they see you as impermanent, how does that impact the relationship? Do they assume you're going to leave? Another common thing that can come up in transfers is a sense of competition. Are you somebody that's from a very similar social location from me? The number of times I've heard a client say, we're so similar, and I wished sometimes that I could be in your chair. And I see that as a kind of competition, but also a kind of shame. Something about achievement that has come up where the client sees reflected in me something about them that is attached to a failure narrative. And that gives us something to work with. It makes our relationship stronger as long as I know how to work with it and acknowledge it. Based on how we present and our practice setting, people have lots of assumptions about who we are in the world and the kind of power we have. So if I were to go to a white therapist, let's say a white gay male therapist, let's say a white gay male that's tall with broad shoulders and a six-pack, although hopefully I wouldn't know that he has a six-pack if we're adhering to, appropriate boundaries. But he doesn't have to take off his shirt for me to assume that that's what he looks like. I'm going to have assumptions about how he moves through the world and why things might be easier for him than for me. How does that show up in the transference? Well, I might be resentful of him. I might have this idea that he doesn't know what I go through. And to be sure, he probably does not. But if he can be attuned to that transference and he can sense my resentment or my hesitation, we can have a conversation about that, or we can process what it's like for me as somebody in a subordinated or marginalized position to navigate a world that is made up of and constructed through the lens of white supremacy. I also think about the times when clients can be specifically frustrated toward the practitioner, and we get confused. We think, I'm here to help. I don't understand why you're so frustrated with me, and yet you keep coming back. I think when we experience that, there's information there about who the client is in the world and how they may have complicated relationships with other people, how they may get frustrated with other people, the specific nuanced ways in which they might not allow other people to help them, and the ways that their frustration pushes people away. Conversely, we sometimes think about how we have these beautiful experiences where clients tell us we're the only one who gets them. And I think that's something that's equally useful to analyze and examine. And we must think about how we can use that information. If I'm the only person that gets you, that makes me feel good, but it should also be worrying. Does that mean you don't see yourself reflected anywhere else in the world? I hope I'm doing a good job, but now I'm concerned. I'm listening in a different way about how you might idealize me or how you might become further disenchanted with the need to build other relationships outside our therapeutic dynamic. So I've already tiptoed into me as the practitioner and what my reaction is to the client. So what we're talking about when we talk about a practitioner's reaction to a client, we're talking about countertransference. It's essentially the clinician's transference based on the clinician or the practitioner's emotional needs and conflicts, things that come up for us from our own history, our own emotional process, our own defense, and a lot of it happens on an unconscious level. I'm going to give you an example of just how unconscious our reactions to clients can be. I was supervising a student who had a client who had suffered a significant amount of neglect in her childhood. And the student therapist felt really not just empathetic, but felt a lot of deep sympathy for the client. And the student therapist reported to me in supervision and said, I feel broken inside because this client was not even fed proper food, was given leftovers from the rest of the family. I won't go into the details of the extent of the neglect, but this client was sometimes even given dog food. She was severely neglected even when the family had money. Now, the student's therapist talks about how broken she feels when she hears this. And I said to the student therapist, what is it? How do you think it's impacting your relationship to be in this space of sympathy? And the student therapist says, well, I think for the most part, I'm managing it and containing it because the client is doing okay in the present. The client is wealthy, she's middle class. Her most essential needs are met. And she's able to come for one-on-one work, which says to me she's in a better place. Fast forward 2 months, it's around holiday time, and the student therapist is looking for me, like in the hallways of the agency I worked at, and she says, Rahim, a really awful thing happened. And I said, well, what happened? She said, you know that client I told you about? And I said, yes, we talk about them weekly, so of course I know. And the student therapist says, well, they asked me about my life, and they asked me about what I was doing for the holidays. And I told them I'm baking a bunch of cookies for my kids. And so the client said, I would love to taste your cookies. And so I promised them I would bake them a whole batch. And I said, oh, okay, that's kind of nice of you. It's tiptoeing out of the frame of the relationship, but did you bring this client cookies? And the student therapist said, no, that's the thing. I was just so busy. I forgot in the mayhem of everything going on around the holidays. And the client came in and was looking for them and was just so disappointed. And so here we're talking about a kind of unconscious countertransference reaction where the student therapist reenacted. There was an unconscious role response around deprivation. Something got reenacted. And on the deepest levels, it was nobody's fault, but it gave us a lot of insight into just how neglected the client has felt before and the specific ways in which people around the client can feel helpless and let the client down. Now, that was a deep example, right? That was mostly unconscious, and it took us a while to uncover that. We're going to stay on this slide for a minute, and I'm going to give you other everyday examples of countertransference. So for example, you're working with a retired single woman who says she's isolated while also berating all of the people who attend her seniors group. You feel like she's given you an impossible task to help her reduce her isolation, and you feel a bit trapped in this therapeutic relationship, and it brings up guilt for you. So your countertransference reaction is of guilt. It's of feeling helpless, and it's got you wondering how you can help this person. Are there ways to help this person? Can this person be helped? Are you the only one that could help this person? What does it say that she berates everybody but likes to work with you? Does she berate you when you're not around? Another example. A client says they cannot meet at the times you have available and requests a weekend appointment. You usually don't do weekend appointments, and you've been wanting to have better boundaries around work and some self-care time. Nevertheless, you schedule it, you log in to meet them on Saturday morning, but they're a no-show. Next time they email you, your tone has become a bit short. This is a classic example of deviating from your frame. When you do something and you make an accommodation for a client that you wouldn't normally do, you're being nice, you're creating accessibility, but it's not helpful for the client if you're then resentful of them. And you're resentful of them because the nature of your relationship changed when you decided to deviate from your frame and give them a weekend appointment. So you're not a bad person for giving them a weekend appointment. The question is, what got incited in you to do that? And how can you maintain better boundaries with the client? And when you do maintain better parameters, how do you notice that to be a shift in the work that you're doing? Does the client get better? Does your relationship get strengthened? Another example of everyday countertransference. You're working with somebody you really like, and they're smart, quick-witted, and always on time. You've struggled with anxiety and depressions in the ways that are similar to them, and you are able to support them adequately. In fact, things are so good, you never bring them up in clinical supervision. So many of us have had those clients. In fact, if you have too many of those clients, sometimes you think, hey, I don't need clinical supervision, right? Sometimes when things are going really, really well, what's happening in the countertransference is mutual blindness. That's a term that I borrowed from Dr. Malin Forrest. And the mutual blindness is about not acknowledging some of the things that are happening in the space that are perhaps counter to the client's betterment. There could be things, I don't want to assume that there's a bad side effect to this, but acknowledging that, you know, we're colluding and we work in a particular way and we don't bring up certain things is an important one. On another example, on more than one occasion, you're a few minutes late for a particular client. You really like them, you have a good relationship with them, and you kind of assume that they're the most flexible person on your caseload, and so somehow it'll be fine. What's going on there that you treat them differently? And that when you're late and you expect that they'll be okay with it, the nature of your relationship has changed a little bit. They're now doing something for you. You're relying on them in an interesting way. You're relying on them to change your work schedule, to change the conditions of your labor requirements. What's going on there? How have you come to rely on them? What do you get out of it? Do they like that? Do they like being the very flexible person that you can lean on? What relationship gets recreated there? All right, now let's talk about exploring countertransference. So if you are a practitioner, and this could be any kind of practitioner, right? You could be a social worker, a psychotherapist, a psychologist, a registered counselor. Some questions that your supervisor might ask you are, what do you think it means if you really like or really dislike your client? What does that mean? What information can you draw from that? Can you develop some good questions? And how does your own subjective experience guide your inquiry and treatment? People might be wondering why I use the language treatment. As a social worker, many of my peers don't like that language. But I oscillate between the therapy, the relationship, the process, and treatment. I think they're interchangeable, but I also think the language of treatment is important because I really don't want social workers to undervalue the kind of work they do. I think in their one-on-one dynamic and their one-on-one work with clients, they do a kind of work that's of a similar caliber to psychologists, although it's often more imposed upon and guided by other demands by their workplaces. So anyway, that's just a note on the use of the word treatment. Another question a supervisor might ask a practitioner to support them in exploring countertransference would be, what is your rationale for deviating from the therapeutic frame with this client, right? Why do you want to create an accommodation? How would that be helpful? How would that backfire? How would they come to expect that later on? And then how might you disappoint them, thereby recreating a disappointment from an earlier time in their life? If you as a practitioner can examine your inner thoughts, your wishes, your desires, and feelings about the client, what might you learn about how they operate in the world or the impact they have on other people? Sometimes I think, oh, I wish this client wasn't in so much pain. They're just so nice and they're so articulate. Sometimes I've even thought, there's an erotic countertransference where I think they're just so attractive. If only they could have more confidence in the world. And if I can be vulnerable and talk about that and analyze that, I might think, there's something about this person where people don't want to see that they have feelings, but rather they sexualize them to avoid that. Or perhaps I have some preconceived notions about how easy things are for that client that I sexualize them in order to avoid thinking about their plight and their difficulty in the world. So there's lots to examine when it comes to countertransference. Now, we're talking about working in communities you belong to. So far, we haven't talked about that specifically. We've talked about just transference and countertransference as concepts, and I've given you some examples of how that shows up in a one-on-one dynamic. So I'm going to present 5 cases. And with each case, I'm going to give you a bit of a description of the case scenario. So the 5 cases we're going to talk about are Malin, Izumi, Zainab, Mandla, and Poppy. I'll read a bit about the client, and then what I'm going to talk about is some of the countertransference issues that might come up in the therapeutic relationship. Steph, next slide. And what I'd love for you to do is in the chat box, think about good questions you could ask that practitioner as somebody supporting them, as their supervisor. Okay, this is about supporting practitioners who are working in communities they belong to. So let me first tell you about Malin. Malin is working with a young woman who is really struggling with her sexuality. The client reports regularly trying to pray in hopes that she will wake up one day and desire a man so that she can just, quote unquote, be normal and feel more aligned with her creator. Malin has spent 3 sessions exploring the client's relationship with her church and family. She wants to challenge the client, but is hesitant to move too quickly. The client stopped attending sessions after the 5th. What the therapist later wondered was if it would have made a difference if the client knew she was also a lesbian with a wife and a child. So take a moment to process some of that. So what's going on in the countertransference with Malin? First, I would say that the practitioner here is struggling with neutrality. She's overemphasizing neutrality. She's thinking, I'm a queer person. I don't want to make this client feel like I'm pushing a particular agenda. And so if I overemphasize neutrality, when we get to a place of affirmation, the client will believe me more. So there's a fear of pushing a political agenda and pushing the client away. There's also some apprehension about which disclosures to make. So for example, she's not just queer. Let's say Malin was also atheist. Would she want to tell the client that? If she selectively told the client that she was a queer person, but didn't tell her she was an atheist and later found out, how would that affect the relationship? Is there a chance Malin is uncomfortable? She's not just thinking about the client's, what's in the client's best interest, but there's discomfort with her own vulnerability because she knows that if she shares something about herself, the client might attack in the most subtle of ways. I've had this experience as a queer Muslim person counseling an older queer Muslim, specifically South Asian man, who said to me, "Are you gay?" And I said, "Well, yes." And he said, "Are you Muslim?" And I said, "Yes." And I can feel the discomfort show up for me because I'm thinking about, how does this guy see me? Why is he asking me these personal questions? How do I answer? How do I respond to these disclosures? I could say, "Is that important to you?" But I can't really. A straight person could say that, but I'm working in a context where it's presumed that we share similar identities. And so as soon as I disclose those things about myself, the client says, well, you know, you can't really be both because it's in the Quran that being gay is not acceptable. You're going to go to hell. Now this session has become about me, but not only has it become about me, it makes me extremely defensive. And if I know I'm going to get defensive, it's a trigger point for myself and I might avoid it. Now, in my countertransference, if I'm avoiding, that might not be a good thing. But if I know I'm going to be immediately defensive, it might be safer. So I want to take a pause here for a moment. And I'd love for folks in the chat box to really share some questions. What do you want to ask Malin that might support her in processing her reaction to this client and her fear? You know, she probably also has a fear that she missed an opportunity to provide something affirming to a client, to tell this client that they probably will be okay. Steph, are we seeing anything in the chat box? Not yet, right?
No, nothing that I can see, Rahim.
Okay, no sweat, no pressure. I'm going to tell you what I think. I mean, that's why you're here anyway, but hopefully this gets you thinking about how to support practitioners when they're working in a community they belong to. So I might ask Malin, look, how much do you think the client knew about you before beginning their work with you? Why do I ask that? Because transference from the client's perspective begins way before they even come into the room. If they looked you up somewhere, if they have assumptions about the setting you work in, if they saw your photo on Psychology Today, right? Something begins in their minds about their expectations and the scripts that they assign to you. So it could be that this person thinks you look pretty visibly queer, and people look at me and they don't really have to ask. They're like, this gay does his eyebrows. He's one of us, you know? And if they're asking a question, it might be to incite a conflict. And maybe there's an intention, a subtle intention to reenact something, a conflict that they have out in the world, or an inner dialogue that's made up of polarities within oneself that they want to have play out in the therapy, but they want you to move the needle. They want to be able to move it a step further than they're able to do with a lay person. So they're counting on you to have this argument with them, but in a different way than anybody else has. So my question is, how much do you think they knew about you before beginning their work with you? Is there a chance they were subtly recruiting you to recreate two sides of their internal struggle? I like this idea of recruiting, because sometimes my people I supervise will say, I feel like they wanted me to fight with them. I feel like they were making me upset. And I'd say, okay, so don't get upset. Be curious. What are they recruiting you for? What do they want an answer to? What kind of internal battle is playing out in your dynamic with them? And is there a chance they left the therapy when you didn't participate? Maybe not participating is good. You didn't enable something that's toxic. Maybe next time you need to participate and see if you can do it differently and surprise them. And they might say, hey, I didn't think you'd have that reaction. And you would say, okay, what reaction did you think I was going to have? Who else in your life has had that reaction? Or better yet, who else in our community tends to have that reaction? So this is where they start to see you as somebody safe and somebody who gets them, who's from their community, but also somebody who's not quite like somebody from their community. Another question for Malin, when you notice yourself overemphasizing neutrality with a client, what fears of your own have been activated? And here, it's very specific. Do you worry that you're going to experience rejection? Is that what comes up for you? The way you experience rejection from a bully on a schoolyard, the way you experience rejection from a family member, an uncle, an aunt, a close cousin, a best friend, right? Sometimes we're in these academic fields and we're in these sophisticated circles of conversation where prejudice and bigotry is a very, it absolutely exists, but it's hidden and it's expressed in a way that we can tolerate and it's palatable. But what happens when you're in this raw situation where somebody says something where you can't respond because it's not sugar-coated, it's not subtle, it's just a plain old argument that you've heard 100 times that you haven't been able to respond to? Does it bring out a freeze reaction in you, right? If you're freezing, perhaps you're getting close to your own trauma that you need to think about. The last question I want to ask Melon is, what part of yourself did you see in the client? And are you still grieving that part of you? When I've had interactions with people who are struggling in particular with faith and sexuality, I do see part of myself in them, and it makes it really tough. Figuring out which direction to go in. Do I want to ask good questions? Do I want to do psychoeducation? Do I want to effectively use some self-disclosure? What parts of myself am I making vulnerable? But also, I might just continue to hear somebody else's story and be present for them and be very well aware when the session ends of my own deep grief around needs not met, around abandonment, around decisions not celebrated, maybe in a religious community or in my family of origin. That's Malin. I'm going to talk about another practitioner.
Rahim?
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say there are a few comments in the chat box. Do you want to have a look at them?
Lovely.
Before we
Yes,
move
thank you
on?
so much. Yes,
Awesome,
absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so what do you think the worst thing is that can happen if you had to disclose that you are a lesbian and atheist? That's a great question. Yes. Like, what would happen? Like if you said, you know, this has been my journey and this is where I've come to. What's your reaction to that? I think we have to be very careful not to be prescriptive about that. Maybe it confirms for them that you can't be two things, religion of faith and queer. Maybe that's something that they need to grieve and they need to rediscover. So I think that's an appropriate question. Another person says, oh, you know what? If the client asked me, I would disclose. Another person says, I think the client is very afraid to explore this, and she gets closer when she gets closer, she becomes more afraid. That may be why she didn't return. Beautiful. So we're really thinking about the client not returning is not a fault of anybody's, but really it's an indicator that we reached a point where there's a sense of overwhelm and the client needs a break, right? And it's that precise anxiety that they leave with that gives them something to process when they're gone. And that same anxiety will bring them back to process this with you. Could Malin's disclosure or affirmations unintentionally be seen as advice or swaying the client? Yes. I mean, I think that's what she's worried about, and that's why she's overemphasizing neutrality. But yes, absolutely, making that explicit in the supervision would be very helpful. Okay, and the one other one that I'll read out, it says, I think that the client is hiding something and it hit a soft spot. That really gets me thinking, you know, when the client is hiding something, it makes me think about how the client might be really curious about the therapist or have a lot of assumptions about the therapist, resentment towards the therapist, adoration, and they're poking and they want to know more. I'm going to move us to the next practitioner example. So thank you for your contributions, folks. And in the same way, I'd love to hear what you think is going on for Izumi and how we might support her. Izumi is a therapist who specializes in supporting survivors of intimate partner violence. On her website, she states specifically that she's trained as a psychologist and also has lived experience as a survivor. She's working with a new mother whose husband's anger got more out of control than she's ever seen before. She states he didn't hit her, but she was quite shaken up. He got upset about the baby being unable to be soothed at dinner, and he suddenly threw a plate of food at the wall, leading it to be shattered and make a mess everywhere. The client says she's not sure if she wants to leave the home at this point. She has finances and stability to consider, especially because her mother-in-law helps with childcare. Izumi goes into lecture mode during the session and says, look, you absolutely have to leave your husband right now. I can tell you from my personal experience, it doesn't get better. Staying with your husband will harm your child and ultimately be selfish. The client goes silent and feels ashamed. So what's going on in the countertransference for Izumi? And I don't blame Izumi. These are common blind spots, and lots gets activated for us when we work in communities that we belong to. In this instance, I think the practitioner is over-identifying with the client. And I just want to point out that you could probably imagine that this kind of interaction doesn't just happen in a long-term psychotherapy dynamic. It also happens in crisis management, crisis counseling, case coordination, supportive counseling settings, phone counseling, as well as other instances. So in this case, we're seeing that Izumi over-identifies with the client, and she feels personally triggered because of her own history. And what we don't know really is, was it a partner in her life that was abusive? Was she a bystander? Was she a vulnerable child witnessing violence in her home? Was she on the periphery of violence through someone else in her community or who was close to her? What I also see is that Izumi is deviating from her usual way of operating by being directive. I'm assuming usually she's not directed. Usually people who work in violence against women setting know and are very familiar with the statistics that it often takes women 7 attempts before they leave an abusive relationship. And this is nobody's fault. It's part of the cycle of abuse. It's the ways in which a toxic dynamic is created, and an abusive person is able to get people to buy into their apologies, but also cultivate a kind of dependency in the relationship. So I assume Izumi knows all of this, but so much gets enacted in this countertransference. And some people might say, you know what? She was directive with the client and that was helpful. Other people would say, in that instance, the shame was not helpful because it might mean that the client goes back to the abusive partner, but later doesn't disclose when things get difficult to her practitioner in the future. So it could go in multiple ways. All right, I'm going to open the chat box. People can respond and tell us, what questions do you want to ask Izumi? And while you're formulating questions that you want to ask Izumi to help them in the most compassionate way to process their reactions to their client, I'm going to share some of my ideas. So I might ask Izumi, what is your biggest fear with regards to your client? Oh, I'm seeing people put things in the chat box, so I'm just going to look at that first. How did what the client described affect you? What did it bring up for you? How do you think your response will affect the relationship? I think that's really important to think about, right? Like, what do you think is going on? And now that this has happened, now that you've shared in this way, let's not feel bad about it, but let's think a little bit about if it's caused a rupture in the relationship and how we might fix it together, or how we might process it at a later time. When I've had a rupture with clients where I've been too directive, I've come back and I said, you know, I said that earlier and I realized that tone was not appropriate. I was telling you what to do and I shouldn't have. And I think a fear came out in me. And sometimes the client will say, oh no, that's okay. I know you care about me. And I've apologized and we've reestablished that there's care in the relationship. Maybe something else in the sessions led Izumi to think that the client or the baby might be in danger. Yes, absolutely. I think there's a distinction between how, we tend to think about, even though the client is our client, when a child is involved, we sometimes shift and we think about the child more than the client. Maybe we think about both of them as our clients, right? I know that we have a tendency to decenter a mother sometimes by overemphasizing a child. We do that a lot with unborn children. We see this in our popular culture all the time. Lots of people have lots of opinions about unborn children. And to the extent where we decenter the person who is the object that we're talking about, the subject that we're talking about. Do you think the client is already sitting with shame in telling you about her abusive relationship? And how can you better support her in the shame instead of further activating it? Yes. So asking a question like, hey, you know, what is it like for you to tell me about this thing that happened? It must be hard for you to make the decision to stay. I see that you're weighing out logistics and survival in a way that not everybody would be able to do. What is that like for you? And then she could talk about her shame, and you could say, what if we were to act on that shame? Is this a good shame or a bad shame? Is it something that tells us, is it directing the decisions we need to make? Or is it just hard to be in this space? Another question we might ask is, how did you feel after you lectured the client? And what stopped you from carrying on with this lecture? So we're really helping the client come back to the space and think about the field, the space between themselves and the client. And what cues did they pick up on? And how when they stopped, the client might have also noticed that the clinician was a bit out of line. The last question, is there a greater emphasis on the power in the relationship between Izumi and the client that's creating a barrier to effectively assist the client? So when we talk about the power in the relationship, this is very important, right? How does the client, knowing that Izumi has some kind of lived experience that brings her to the table, how is Izumi judging how the client navigates this world and moves through this difficult life situation? I feel that prior to the session, Izumi, understanding the context surrounding the client and the abusive dynamic, should have referred the client based on her trigger and then question why she got triggered, to the extent as instilling a feeling of shame. And it's really interesting to think about, if somebody feels ashamed in our session, does that mean we've made it unsafe? And is that the time where we refer them onward? This is tricky business, because I think when you make a decision to work in a community you belong to, I think you can anticipate that there's a chance you're going to get triggered at some point. So thank you to all those who participated and shared their insights. I'm going to just add to those with some of my questions that I have for Izumi. What is your biggest fear with regard to your client? What are you worried will happen? I might also ask, Izumi, if you were the child in that picture, how would you cope? What would you be seeing? Tell me about your confusion if you were the child. Why do I do that? What therapy modalities does that come from? It's very Gestalt. It makes us think about how we develop our own creative adjustments or our own adaptations. So will the child be affected long-term? Yeah, there's a good chance. Will the child find a way to adapt in the moment? Absolutely. They'll become withdrawn, they'll cry, they'll be hungry, they'll redirect the conflict so that their needs become known, or they'll withdraw in hopes that they don't exacerbate the conflict. Is that a child's job? Absolutely not. Will the child cope for a little while? Yes. And is it more helpful for Izumi to be able to think about that as she helps her clients navigate these difficult situations? My next question for Izumi is, can you describe the kind of urgency you experience in the session? And did it match the clients? Sometimes I wonder, where did the urgency come from? If the client doesn't feel a kind of urgency, maybe you're feeling it on her behalf. Maybe there's a kind of projective identification. And it might be, instead of exuding the urgency in the tone, it might be more helpful to name the feeling that's not showing up or that you are embodying on behalf of your client. So you might say something like, you know, this is such a difficult situation. You seem really calm, and yet what's transpired makes me think that there's urgency around your next steps. How do you feel about that? How are you able to be calm? Is there urgency coming up for you? Another question might be, in your work, how often do you find yourself trying to defy the statistics and disrupt the behavioral patterns you've come to know so well? I think that's kind of an interesting question. I think I don't work in such a sector, but if I did, and I was a survivor of intimate partner violence, I can only imagine how I might want to say, I don't want this person to be a statistic. I don't want this person to be a statistic. And I might have this almost like a delusion, but a helpful one, coming from a well-intentioned place. A delusion's not a nice word, maybe a fantasy that I can change the stats with the people I work with, right? And there needs to be a reminder that, women don't go back to abusive partners because they're stupid. They go back because patriarchy is really, really toxic. And the division of labor when it comes to children is really skewed toward women. And people who are abusive have a tendency to cultivate dependency in a very unique way. It would be unfair to me and the client for me to rely on this fantasy that I'm going to disrupt the statistics of what tends to happen in each of my settings. So it might be useful to reflect on how often I feel that, because then I might start to feel like a failure. And then that's not particularly helpful. The last question I have for Azumi is, I wonder if we can analyze your own subjectivity and create questions for the client that can increase her agency and contain her fear. So what do I mean by that? What is this language, your own subjectivity? Well, your own subjectivity is your own lived experience. So if Azumi says, in my lived experience, I was the child and I got very, very scared. And then I always wanted to protect my mom. Okay. So let's turn that into questions. I would ask the client, how did your child react? What did your child do? And depending on the age, they might demonstrably be trying to protect mom. So based on the Azumi's subjective life experience, she can make assumptions about what might be going on, and she might check that out with her client by creating exploratory questions. And that's something I would want to do as an object or as a goal of our supervision. All right, I hope I'm not tiring you out and you're staying with me. Next case, we've got Zainab. Zainab is a school social worker and provides one-on-one support to students when a need has been identified by a teacher. Zainab wanted to work in a school setting because she grew up in a home of many siblings and busy parents. School was her sanctuary, and she performed well, allowing her to gain a full scholarship to university. She's been assigned a student who is a young Muslim girl who is having trouble academically, is defying her parents by removing her hijab when she's at school, and reports feeling ambivalent about future studies. Zainab provides a safe space for the student, but also comes down on her hard by saying things like, look, I've been in your position before, and rebelling against your parents is energy wasted. You just have to accept the status quo. There's certain things that women have to do, and you should be lucky to have access to education. And as a Muslim woman, it is your duty to represent our community well. Now, right away, you can see there's an over-identifying with the client, but what new things are coming up in the countertransference? So I'll let you write some things down that you would want to explore with Zainab, but I'm going to describe a little bit about what I see coming up in the countertransference. The practitioner is trapped in her own subjectivity. This idea of the sanctuary, her own way out, it's kind of like if you're an undergraduate student and you go to an academic advisor about what you want to do with your future, and they only give you options about further learning. And they say, well, you could do a master's program in this and then a PhD in that. Or you could do a master's program in this and then a postgraduate diploma in that. You would think to yourself, are these the only routes for the person? How limited is the experience of the person you're talking to in that they're not able to think in broader terms? Now, it's not the fault of Zainab. Zainab is smarter than this. She does have a broader view than this. Something's happening with this client where she feels trapped in her own subjectivity. She thinks about this client's pain and a particular way out. I would suggest that Zainab is having difficulty with self-reflexivity and thinking about what it means to be a Muslim woman and to navigate a patriarchal world, and both to be a representative of a community that experiences Islamophobia, to be somebody who both wants to resist patriarchy, but also exists and is embedded in a gender binary in a way that's difficult to dislodge herself or to challenge what she experiences. Sometimes when we see people who are our clients, but they're from our communities, and they have access to a kind of resistance that's different than what we have access to, we might come down hard on them because we're envious, or we think that they're taking an easy route out. This is what Malin Force describes as the queen bee syndrome, where she says that I've experienced something from this subordinated position as a woman, and I'm going to put a lot of pressure on you. In activist communities, sometimes this can be called lateral violence. In a therapeutic sense, it might be how I feel like, how Zainab feels like this young girl just doesn't want to do the work. She doesn't want to navigate the world in a way that's expected of her. And Zainab feels threatened by that because she was expected to. So a lot comes up for Zainab. I'm just going to deviate for a moment. There's been such a clear link to this in my work with a lot of older gay men. When they say, they'll say to me, your generation is talking about marriage equality. When I was your age, people threw things at me when I came out of the gay bar. And I would think, okay, interesting. Now, if our roles were reversed and they were my therapist, I wonder how would that permeate or inform or become a barrier to how they support me. Coming back to Zainab, I'm curious to know what questions you have, supervision questions you have to help support her. All right. I've got a few in the chat here. Maybe she could consider why the school isn't a safe place or sanctuary for the client. Beautiful. So why was it safe for you and why is it not safe for the client? Conversely, the client, this young woman comes to school and removes her hijab. Is it safe for her to express a kind of resistance to something she's questioning in that space? What is it that you want for this client? Is it the same as what she wants? How can you center the client in your role as a practitioner? Do you feel this client is often being told what to do? And are you replicating the same dynamic? How do you think that is for her? And finally, what is your subjective experience of being a Muslim woman? How do you identify with your client? What part of yourself can you see in the client? Exactly. Thank you so much for those. Those are all insightful and they're very similar to some of the ones that I was thinking of. So here we go. Some of my supervision questions for Zainab. What part of you has difficulty empathizing with a young girl? Now, when I ask what part of you, this is the parts question. It comes from experiential therapies like Gestalt or internal family systems. When I say what part of you, the therapist might say something like, the part of me that was reprimanded for questioning authority. The part of me that survived through conformity. The part of me that enjoys rituals that are culturally gendered. Another question that I might ask Zainab, tell me about the social options she has access to that were never a possibility for you. Does that make her hard to understand? Or does it create fear for you? Coming down hard on somebody might be a way to, the subtext might be, you're doing something that I would find extremely scary. Please stop, or I'm worried for you. Now, instead of telling her what to do, saying, you know, there's a kind of bravery you exude in your everyday life. It also makes me worry for you sometimes. I would tell the client that, right? There's two sides to that. Can you tell me about your own fear? Do you worry? Or do you feel powerful in these moments? Do you believe that conformity was a tool for survival for you, Zainab? What does survival look for the client? And what is she surviving exactly in her context? If she's of a different generation, what she's surviving are mixed messages from two different generations. And she's defining herself as a person who is probably navigating two different worlds. She struggles with, she's in a space where she can question things, but also wonders what she wants to keep, what she wants to reform, and what she wants to toss from what she's been assigned. When we work with people from the same community, such as this, we might ask, what feels hard about seeing other people like you? So in this case, other Muslim women perform their Muslimness and womanness in different ways. What am I getting at here? I'm really talking about the shared oppressive condition of group representation, how we worry so immensely and so deeply about how we're seen by the outside world. How do we let some of that go and worry less about the politics of representation and more about the diversity within our own communities? After all, that's why the client was probably assigned to you. And that's why you feel a connection with this client. She specifically needs that permission from Zainab to be her radical self. The last thing I'd ask is, just generally, do you think you've been hard or harsh with this young girl? Why do I ask it like that? Well, more than the previous situation with Izumi, where we know that the client felt ashamed, I have a feeling that Zainab felt righteous by the end of this session. And so I want to explore her blind spot by saying, do you think you've been hard or harsh? And I might say, where does that teaching style come from? Sometimes we slip into a particular way of being when somebody becomes familiar, right? It becomes somewhat of like something like I would describe as a sibling relationship. I imagine my older brother would feel comfortable enough to be firm with me in this kind of way. And I think there's something to explore there. Does this client feel like a younger sibling of yours? Does it feel like an older sibling of yours? How does that dynamic facilitate the relationship? How does it get in the way? Sometimes it means you can say things that another therapist cannot, and that's beautiful. And other times it becomes familial in a way that's not welcomed by the client. All right. We're going to go to case 4, Mandla. Mandla was specifically seeking a therapist who is Black and queer, someone just like them. And they've been working with Josi for 4 months, talking about grief after losing their grandmother, whom they were very close to, and talking about their gender identity. Mandla has been a gender fluid person since they were a child, and only recently felt comfortable claiming a non-binary identity. When Josi explores what has made it difficult for them to articulate their gender identity, Mandla explains that at age 12, they were taken to the mountains for a circumcision, rite of passage, which felt humiliating and traumatizing. It was supposed to, quote, teach them how to be a man. But these lessons felt ill-fitting for them, and exposing their genitals brought up an immense amount of shame. Josi listened empathetically while feeling absolutely deflated. What Josi couldn't share was his positive experience of a similar rite of passage in his community. So Mandla and Josi are from the same LGBTQ community. They have a different experience of gender identity, perhaps also of gender expression. Mandla has come to this person in hopes of a shared understanding. And I think Manla has gotten that. But why does Josi feel deflated? What's coming up for Josi in the countertransference? I think the practitioner is grieving when they recognize and they identify their own privilege. A lot of us feel this around class, gender expression, and other ways in which we move through the world with ease that our clients do not, particularly when we're from the same community that they're from. I think we don't feel the grief as intensely when we're from different communities or when we haven't come together based on a presumption of sameness or shared identities. I think Manla is now, oh, sorry. I made a mistake here. The practitioner case at the top should say Josi. That's my fault. So when we're talking about the countertransference, it's not Manla's, it's Josi's. So Josi is engaging in self-reflection on their own participation in a system that can cause harm. And that's tricky for them. That's complicated. It's not something they necessarily thought about too deeply. And so as a result, they experience a deep sense of shame and desire to conceal their own experience with circumcision. So there's this feeling, they don't have to disclose this at all to their client. Some might say it's inappropriate. But the fact that they feel a desire to conceal it and they experience a kind of shame means that there's something for Josi to explore in supervision and to really process. Now, there's another side here where for Josi, the presumption of sameness allowed the client, Manla, to disclose and share. Right? Manla might not have been able to talk about masculinity and gender and this rite of passage with somebody who's not from a similar community. They both belong to a subordinated position in society as Black queer people. When I say subordinated, I just mean marginalized. I use the term subordinated because they're subject to certain oppressive conditions and there's certain social advantages that they cannot avail themselves of. And so they're able to engage in these nuances of the gender binary and cultural emphasis on masculinity. So their dynamic is beautiful in some ways, but there's some unique things that come up for Josi. What are those things? Well, do people have questions for Josi that they want to ask in the chat box? Oh, there's another larger question in the chat box, but I think we'll have to come back to that a little bit later in the end. So here are my questions for Josi. In what ways, and actually, Steph, as I do this, would you mind to actually just leave it, no problem. So here are my questions for Josi. In what ways was your own understanding of rituals and culture challenged by your client's experience? And how are you integrating the client's experience? Is it as a one-off or a new realization about the system in which you also participate? I want to pause here for a moment. You know, when people say, it's important that counselors, therapists, social workers don't take work home with them. Look, nobody's taking their documentation home with them. If you didn't want to do it in the office, you don't want to do it at home. What you take home with you is this kind of feeling, a reflection on how you live your life in a way that is so different from your clients, and that you have access to certain privileges and social advantages that your clients might not. That's what I take home. And I think about, and I think Josi in this situation thinks about, how do I operate in this system that doesn't serve so many other people? It troubles your own worldview in many ways. From the perspectives of class and economic background, a lot of us might think, if you work with economically disadvantaged people, And not just disadvantaged, that's a nice way of saying it, people who suffer economic injustice each day. You might come home and think, how is it that I live in a place or in a space where I constantly want more things in my home, more salary, more vacations, more richness, more material goods, while there's somebody else whom I work with on a day-to-day basis, and they also want more, but they want groceries next week. They want to be able to take their child to McDonald's for their birthday. They want to be able to have a celebration and acknowledge an anniversary with their partner that's going to cost a month's worth of savings. How do we live these parallel lives and have such different experiences of reality, right? That's the kind of weight we take home with us every day. And I think Josi in this situation is taking this home with him when he's thinking about how he operates in a system that's so difficult for some. How have teachings around manliness and masculinity been helpful for you personally? What would your client have needed to feel equally supported? Not in the session, but in the world, in life. Sometimes we feel guilt, shame, and grief around our privilege. How do those feelings facilitate or hinder your emotional process with the client? I take a deep breath there because it's a complicated question. And that question can be turned into many more questions. We're getting to the final stretch of tonight's presentation. I just have one more case scenario, and then we're going to open up the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to pause for questions in the chat box for the next case scenario, but we'll have overall Q&A after the next case presentation. The last case, Poppy. Based on nobody I know personally, Poppy has decided to join a private practice clinic of social justice psychotherapists. While she really loves her colleagues, it feels a bit isolating that she's the only Black woman on the team. Since she's joined 3 months ago, she's found that 80% of her referrals have been Black clients, while the other therapists have much more racial diversity on their caseloads. She still loves her work, but finds that a lot of what she provides her clients is something the other clinicians cannot. She acutely understands the internal hierarchies within Zulu culture when it comes to social class, education, gender roles, generational differences in thinking, and cultural practices. Poppy is also steeped in academia, so she appreciates the ways culture evolves and doesn't see it as static. This is something she can pass on to clients in an implicit way that's empowering. What's isolating about her work is that she feels much more tired than her colleagues and cannot see as many clients as them because of the weight of the work. That means she also earns less than they do. So what's coming up in the countertransference for Poppy? It is not just about her work with the clients, it's also about the setting. It's also about the dynamics she finds herself in a world that's guided and influenced, informed by, constituted of white supremacy, and also predominantly white practice. How does she get relegated or pigeonholed in certain ways? And how does she both enjoy her work but feel exhausted in a unique way? And at the end of the day, how does she feel like she gets the short end of the stick in terms of her income? And does that permeate or influence how she thinks about the work? Does it take her quickly to a place of burnout or more quickly than her counterparts? Those are all things that I think about. So the first level of countertransference that I think about with Poppy is her shared lived experience between her and her client. I think it carries a different kind of weight than what the other clinicians experience, and it needs to be acknowledged and processed. What does that weight feel like? We need to think about how and name the fact that there's an increased likelihood of her taking her work home in the way that I described earlier. Much of the sessions involves examining the impact of white supremacy and patriarchal gender norms. And a lot of us find this as practitioners when we work with other people who are from the same community and we share a subordinated position in the world. Maybe we're queer, maybe we're women, maybe we're survivors of violence, maybe we have experience with like severe mental illness, maybe we're trans. And we think about how in our shared experience, we experience so many social settings and contexts in a unique way. What are the kinds of internal hierarchies and dynamics that we're aware of that other people aren't, right? We analyze the social structure as a form of resistance and as a form of therapeutic healing. But when you're constantly doing that, that can be exhausting. And what that amounts to is what Malin Forrest calls bicultural and bilingual experience. It's bicultural because we're talking about the nuances in our specific community, and we're also able to talk about the hierarchies and dynamics of people in other communities. So we're able to talk about what it means when, in our own community, when you go to this school and when you marry into this kind of family. We also know when you go to this kind of school and you're surrounded by people from the dominant culture, we have a sense of what the hierarchies are there, what's celebrated, what's different. So this bicultural and bilingual skill that Poppy has is very useful. It's also very tiring and exhausting. Steph, the bullet points, there we go. And does Poppy experience guilt? Sometimes we feel really bad when we can't take on more people and they start to request us. And that is the guilt that we feel when we know we can offer a very specific service, but we're teetering on the edges of burnout. And perhaps there's some resentment coming up for Poppy and being pigeonholed into a practice of focus. I've heard lots of Black therapists, lots of Black queer therapists, lots of transgender therapists say this. They say, I just keep getting referred other people that are like me. And as much as I have expertise in that, it's inappropriate that other people don't have experience or don't feel culturally competent to support clients from these demographic groups. And I feel exhausted. And I also feel like I'm not taken seriously in my career, academically, or as a clinician, because other people don't see me as having the skills needed to work with the broader community. Finally, here are my supervision questions to support Poppy. How does it feel when your clients know that you really understand them, right? That might be really good. It might be specifically rewarding. Does the connection you have with your clients make you feel like you're in a familial role with them at times? When is that good? When is that bad? I've had people assume that we're the same kind of Muslim, or because I have a Muslim sounding name, we have the same perspective on certain things. Sometimes that facilitates the conversation and lets me know what they think about Islam, about Allah, about ritual, about adhering to practices, about what it means to be pious, what the consequences are when you're not. Other times it puts me in a stuck position where I'm afraid to disclose that I don't think exactly like they do, even though they've assumed that. What would it be like for you and them if you had to halt or stop your practice? This is where I ask Poppy to really reflect as a therapist, as a social worker, as a counselor, how much she's taking on and how she might create some healthy clinical distance from her clients so that her work feels more sustainable. Tell me about the impact of working with people who in many ways could be you if you didn't grow up with that extra pinch of class access. What are your anxieties, professionally speaking, about working with one population? Are you concerned about your overall worth? This is a question that I used to struggle with myself. And in supervision, I was very lucky to have some, people who said to me, having specialized knowledge working with a particular community is very, very valuable. What you contribute and what your work is very, very important. It doesn't matter if you can't serve everybody. The people who say that they can serve everybody probably can't provide the depth of service you can to this particular community. And that's an important reassurance a lot of us need when we're up against imposter syndrome or finding our place in a larger professional community. The next question I'd ask Poppy is, how do you suppose your peers understand your work with clients to support her in reflecting on the dynamics of her workplace and not sweeping them under the rug? And how do you imagine your peers see you in the picture of the larger clinic? I ask that because sometimes we feel used and taken advantage of, but perhaps people around us are in awe of us. All right, I'm going to just share a couple of citations for further reading, and then I'm going to open the floor for Q&A and general discussion. And Poppy then wants to talk a bit about the social work program at SACAP. So the readings I drew on for this lecture today are first and foremost, a grammar of power of psychotherapy that explores the dynamics of privilege by psychoanalysts from Norway named Malin Forrest, the Kermayer piece and some of their writing on cultural safety and adapting it to a clinical setting, and Jonathan Shedler, who wrote an essay that I assign in every class that I teach called That Was Then, This Is Now, an introduction to contemporary psychodynamic therapy. With that, you can see there's a QR code on your screen if you want to follow me on my social media handles, or you want to join my mailing list. You can just take your phone and turn on the camera and let the QR code take you to where you need to go. At this time, I'd like to open the floor for any final comments and questions. Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming up in the questions. Stephanie, would you want to, actually, you know what? I'm just going to hand it over to Poppy, who's going to talk a bit about the SACAP social work program. Thank you everyone for being here and for tuning in. I hope you tune into our future lectures as part of the practice dialogue.
Thank you, Rahim. Very, very interesting and very informative presentation. I'm actually seeing some comments there. Mandy says this was informative and eye-opening. In actual fact, I feel that it just sets the tone for us to talk about our Community Mental Health Promotion Master's Program, which we are offering at SACAP for those who are keen on studying further. We offer a NQF9 184 credits master's program in community mental health promotion. This is a 2-year part-time program. We are offering it at the Cape Town and Johannesburg campuses. We can take up to 20 students per campus. And currently, because of COVID, we are offering a blended online and face-to-face model, where we provide online lectures as well as face-to-face for specific modules that I'll be talking about later. The way the program is structured, Stephanie, can I see the next slide, please? Is that there are 4 modules that we provide in the evenings that are 10-week long. They last for about two hours. And then we have 4 intensives. These are 1-week long sessions, which we offer on a face-to-face basis. What it means is that if you are registered in our program, for the 4 modules that are online, you will be participating with the Cape Town, we combine both the Cape Town and Johannesburg students, which means that the class might be slightly bigger. And then for our intensive, we do them at the 2 respective campuses. face-to-face. We do ensure that we abide by the COVID-19 protocols. Our classes are very big, so they allow for social distancing. In addition, we provide 4 workshops which are online. These are workshops to support students. Some of the topics that we present today is how to prepare you for your community engagement, as Rahim has been speaking about working in multicultural communities. We expect our students to engage and work in various communities that they belong to or that they choose to work in. They need to identify an agency or an NGO or a community-based organization that they're interested in working with. So our workshop will help you and prepare you on how to gain an entrance and how to build relationships. Our second workshop is on how to succeed your masters, because we understand that a shift from undergrad to masters is very steep. Some of the modules, some of the people that register are employed, so working and studying can be hard. So we provide those tips on how to succeed with your masters. We also provide a workshop on ethics and technology. As you may know, that at master's level, you are required to do research. So there's ethical aspects that you need to be aware of. And we also teach you on how to use technology. We've got tools that we use to analyze the data that we have collected. Finally, we also provide a workshop on how to write your master's dissertation. We know that at undergrad level, you may have done some research on a small scale, but the research that we do at master's, it's more advanced, and it's called community-based participatory action research. It's a new approach that we've adopted, which we believe is key in the sense that you are not going into a community as an expert, knowing what their needs and problems are, knowing how to go about preventing or addressing those needs. With the approach of CPBAR, we expect you to work together with the community as core researchers, as your partners, because we believe they know their needs and they know how best to go about addressing their needs. So the benefits of registering in this program is that you will gain more knowledge and more skills on how to conduct research. You will gain more skills on how to design interventions that will address the identified needs of the community. You'll gain more knowledge on how to manage, to design and manage a project or a program. Some of you may aspire to start your own NGOs or to get into social entrepreneurship. This program will prepare you for those opportunities. You'll also learn on how to use technology in doing research. And we are preparing you to work for various workplaces. In the next slide, Stephanie. With this master's degree, although you don't get registered with the Council either for Social Service Professions or the Health Professions Council of South Africa, but you do get to work in NGOs or NPOs or even for government departments. You also work in corporate companies. As you may know, that a lot of companies provide employee and health and wellness services. So you may find that there's ample opportunities for you there to apply your knowledge and skills as a mental health care practitioner. In government, I've already said that you can work in many departments. Government also provides employee health and wellness services, so you may find job opportunities there. I did also mention that you may want to pursue social entrepreneurship. We know that with our context in South Africa, we're dealing with a lot of unemployment and poverty, which have a direct impact on people's mental health and well-being. So as a social entrepreneur, you may want to initiate interventions and programs or projects that will provide employment opportunities for community members and help them to get out of poverty, as well as improve their mental health and well-being. Additionally, because the master's program has a very big component of research, you will leave our program with more knowledge and more research skills that will enable you to get jobs with research institutes or even in academia, where you can work as a lecturer like myself and Rahim, and also maybe just be a research assistant supervising other students' research projects. In the next slide. Steph. So in a nutshell, this is what how our program is structured. And as Rahim has presented, the information that you've gained tonight will come in handy for you when you venture into those various communities when you register with us. So applications are open. You're most welcome to log onto our website and get more details on how to apply. We've started with selection interviews, so we're looking forward to seeing you in the next year or so. Thank you very much. Over to you, Steph.
Thank you so much, Poppy. And thank you to Rahim. We've got some lovely comments and a few in the Q&A box, just thanking you for your insight and all the information that you've shared with us this evening. Catherine, I see you do have a question about intakes.
Unfortunately, we do only one intake per year. As I've said, that applications are open right now. We've started with interviews. We do intakes at the end of the year with the intention that you register at the beginning of the year. But all you require in order to be selected, you need to have an honors degree in the social sciences. And it could be in social work, psychology, or you may have sociology as your undergrad degree. Any sort of social science postgrad degree, you qualify. And the interview is basically just to get to know you better and also to understand what your needs will be if you do register into a program. So you shouldn't feel like it's a serious interview like you're looking for a job. It's an interview to see that you will be a better fit with our program and that the program is actually what you're looking for.
Thanks so much, Poppy. Then just a reminder that if you would like to follow Rahim, the QR code is available on the slide over here. It is his business card and you will be able to follow him on all these channels. We will once again make this presentation and the recording available to you. So if you do have any other questions, please do leave your email address in the chat box or you can leave it in the Q&A box. And we'll definitely contact you. If you'd like to follow us on our social media, you can find out more about our following workshops, which will be happening in 2022, also hosted by Rahim, and Poppy will be joining us as well. So yes, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel, which will also host all the recordings of our webinars. So yes, thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you for staying with us throughout this presentation.